You sent in some really interesting stuff this time, and we're diving right into the whole world of short-form content. I mean, specifically how brevity, how keeping things short shapes the way we experience music and language. It's fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. The sources you gave us, they really offer a good starting point for figuring out, like, why artists, or I guess anyone trying to communicate, would choose to be concise. So I guess our mission today is to really uncover the evolution, like how we got here, the purpose behind it all, and the big impact this trend towards being brief has had on creative expression. And we're focusing on, like you said, short musical pieces, and then, this is a cool one, the emergence of new forms of language, almost like what they call slangcronyms.
Okay, yeah, let's break it all down. And maybe a good place to start is with those short songs, right? What the source calls those sonic snapshots. And, going through the material, it struck me that the idea of a short musical piece isn't really a new thing. Like, we've got those art songs by Ned Rorem, a lot of them clocking in under 3 minutes, but they feel so complete. And then there's Shel Silverstein, right, with his short songs, some even less than a minute long, but they still manage to get a whole idea across. And even some movements from orchestral works, they can be surprisingly short too. It's almost as if these are like these miniature musical arguments, incredibly concise and impactful.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that, like, across all those examples, the goal has always been to create a complete musical statement, no matter how long or short it is. Some of the sources suggest that, practical things could contribute to that brevity, like how naturally our energy ebbs and flows when we're playing an instrument, manually, and that often faster tempos lead to shorter pieces. It's just a natural outcome of the way we play.
That totally makes sense. It's like the energy of the music itself kind of dictates its length. And it's interesting how the technology of the time also played a part, right? Like,
Yeah.
on those old records, slower songs often ended up being those final tracks, almost like an afterthought, or even those hidden tracks on tapes and CDs. Such a different experience from how we listen to music now.
Right. And, if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the reasons why a song is short, those reasons have really changed over time. So back in the 50s and 60s, as you said, it often came down to the physical limits of, how much music you could fit on a record or what radio stations would actually play. But more recently, it seems like being short and sweet is a much more deliberate choice, like an artistic choice.
Definitely. And Shel Silverstein's quote really captures that shift, right? He said, people won't listen to more than 30 seconds, so let's make it that long. Which is, I don't know, kind of a cynical take, but it gets right to the point. And then there's the whole streaming world with those, I guess you could call them micro royalties. One source even called them nano royalties. So artists may be thinking, okay, if I'm only going to get paid a tiny amount per stream, why make a really long song?
Right. So it went from being like a limitation, a technological thing, or a broadcasting constraint, to being this intentional decision by artists like, hey, I want to capture attention in this incredibly busy world. And that raises this whole other question about, like, how we even experience musical duration. How long a song feels isn't just about the actual clock time. The sources talk about things like musical density, like how much is happening in the music, the instruments, the rhythms, the melodies, and then there's our mood, what's happening around us. Even the space we're in, it all can change how we perceive time. I mean, if you're stressed, even a short song can feel like way too long, or just kind of annoying because it ends abruptly.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely been there. And on the flip side, with those longer pieces, the big hurdle is holding the listener's attention. Because without enough variation, like in the melody or harmony, a long song can get, well, boring, even if it's technically impressive. The source brought up Philip Glass, who's known for those really repetitive minimalist compositions that can be super long.
Yeah.
And also the serialist composers. It seems like to really appreciate their work, you need some background knowledge, like their compositional techniques or the historical context.
Oh, sure. I mean, how we receive music is tied to what we already know and, like,
Yeah.
the context surrounding it. So without that framework, longer, more minimalist or tonal pieces, yeah, they can feel, challenging or repetitive, and not necessarily in a good way.
Okay, so one source brought up something really interesting, this idea that the short song might be turning into a gimmick. Like, now that it's so common, it might be losing that original artistic spark. And it even suggested that Silverstein's whole approach, like that directness, it could end up sounding dated in the future, sort of like, some of those super early Beatles tracks that were really short. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's definitely something to consider. There's this fine line, right, between a concise, creative statement that really hits you and something that just feels like a novelty act. And a lot of it hinges on how it's used and whether it leaves a lasting impression. Like, does it stick with you after the song is over?
Right. And then there's this concept of what they call the 2.30 threshold.
Hmm.
Apparently around that point, people start to lose focus if they're listening to something unfamiliar. And short songs, they just bypass that whole issue because they don't even bother with the traditional song structure, like no big intro, no instrumental bridge, no drawn-out outro. It's all killer, no filler.
Yeah, and that's a great point. By doing away with all that, short songs basically give you like a direct injection of the core musical idea. It's right there, no waiting.
Which is so different from classical sonata form, where the length of a piece wasn't determined by like some random time limit. It was all about how those musical ideas naturally unfolded. So you have that initial presentation of the themes, then they get explored and varied, and then they come back at the end. And the length of each section, it was driven by what the composer saw as I love this phrase, a cogent musical idea. Like it had to have its own internal logic and completeness.
Exactly. It was about serving the idea, not the other way around. But here's the thing. The source also suggests that, this intentional use of short songs, it could actually be a really clever creative strategy, like a cunning creative device, if it ends up having a lasting influence. They compare it to the impact of minimalism in art, how it was a reaction against the whole abstract expressionism movement.
Right? Like a deliberate shift in aesthetics and how we perceive art. And speaking of intentional shifts, we can't forget the whole punk era. Those songs were short, loud, and often angry, and the source even called them profoundly epical. They definitely made a huge impact.
They did. They captured this raw energy, the spirit of rebellion, and it resonated with a lot of people at the time. But like the source mentions, short songs today don't seem to have that same widespread influence on how most music is being made. It's more of a niche thing.
Yeah, for sure. But the takeaway here, it seems like, is that the length of a piece, just like any other limitation an artist might have, it can actually be a powerful tool for making art. It forces you to get straight to the point, to really boil down your ideas to their essence.
Absolutely. And the source even pointed out a few really interesting pressures that are shaping this trend today. Like back in 2014, it was all about battery life. People wanted their devices to last longer, so shorter media made sense. And then in 2022, we got this explosion of platforms like YouTube Shorts and TikTok, which are specifically designed for really short form video and by extension, short music too. So yeah, technology definitely plays a role in all of this.
Okay, so we've looked at those sonic snapshots, those short songs. Now let's shift gears and dive into the world of language, and specifically this whole thing with what the source calls slangcronyms, like a new kind of slang that's emerging from hashtags.
This is where it gets really cool. The source talks about how versatile hashtags are. Like they can hold all this extra meaning, they can sum up complex concepts in a really concise way, and they can even function as a kind of digital metaphor. They're like a title, a parenthetical comment, or like a slangcronym, similar to, AMA, Ask Me Anything. It's this whole new dialect of slang that's totally intertwined with the internet, truly acculturated with code. Think about something like hashtag TBT, Throwback Thursday. It's gone beyond just being a tag. It evokes this whole feeling of nostalgia and a very specific way of sharing on social media.
It's like these small, self-contained linguistic packages that carry so much weight, way more than just the letters themselves. And the source makes this really interesting connection to how music subgenres blew up in the 90s, partly because of remixing. It basically says that remixes are to music what these new hashtag forms are to language. It's like linguistic remixing.
It is. It's a brilliant analogy because just like remixing takes existing musical elements and puts them in a new context, to create something totally fresh, these new forms of language, they take words and symbols we already have and give them this whole new layer of meaning and function online. It's fascinating.
And get this, the source even brings in David Bowie, who of course loved experimenting and playing with words, like his fascination with the cut-up technique. It connects that same spirit of linguistic experimentation to both hashtags and musical remixes. It's amazing to see those connections across different creative fields, right? Like it's all connected.
It really shows how artists and creators are always trying to find these new ways to play with and reshape their mediums. And the source even breaks down some of the ways this language remix happens. There's simple abbreviation, then what they playfully call acronymization, and then making up totally new words or phrases, neologism. They all involve cutting up or shortening existing language.
Yeah, it's like linguistic surgery. And to illustrate this whole idea of removing something intentionally, to make it work in a specific way, the source brings up drop frame in film editing. So that's where they intentionally remove some frame numbers to get the time code to match up with the actual clock time. And it explains that while drop frame isn't slang, it's doing something similar, like streamlining information to get a specific result.
Exactly. It's all about making things more efficient or getting a certain kind of synchronization. And then the source brings up this hypothetical idea of drop vowel as a kind of linguistic parallel. So they give examples like allowed becoming allowed or disappearing becoming disappearing. It's a fun way to think about like what's essential in a word and what's kind of redundant.
And it even connects that to musical notation. Like if you've got accidentals indicated in the key signature, you don't need to write them out again every time they appear in the same bar. It's about being efficient and everyone understanding the rules of the system.
Which leads to this really important practical point about searching for things online. The source emphasizes how search algorithms, they rely on full words. So all these shortened forms and slang terms, they can really mess things up unless there's a way for the system to recognize them and their variations. Like it needs some kind of synonymization.
But that's where hashtags are so useful, right? They act like built-in synonymization.
Yeah.
So you search for one hashtag and you find this whole network of related terms and conversations. Plus, they add all those conceptual meanings and functions we talked about before, like they're metadata. They're more than just a word.
Exactly. Hashtags solve that problem by being both a searchable tag and this rich source of extra information and context. They can even convey emotion, which is really interesting.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's amazing to see these similar forces shaping both how short music is evolving and these really inventive ways we're condensing and layering meaning and language with these slangcronyms. It's like constraint breeds creativity.
I think that's a great way to put it. Whether it's the limitations of a musical format or the character limits in a tweet, those limitations, like we've seen, they can be really powerful catalysts for making something new, both in music and language. They force us to be resourceful, to find new, efficient ways to express complete ideas in a smaller space.
And it really gets you thinking, doesn't it? With so much micro-content everywhere, not just in music and language, how is that changing our attention spans? And how is it changing the way we create and communicate in general? I mean, what new slangcronyms or sonic miniatures might pop up because of this whole push toward brevity? Something to ponder, for sure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.